Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us here today. Over to you.
Hello. Okay, this works. Okay. Thank you for being here. There's some kind of strange noise going on. Some people. No, front. Okay. No, right. So this is a session. I mean, we're having lots and lots of sessions on Satyajit Ray because of the anniversary, centenary. But we are going to be talking about, it's been titled, I think by Malavika, the writing gene when it comes to Satyajit Ray. And I just want to, before I begin, hold up this book. It's called 3 Rays, Stories from Satyajit Ray, which has an enormous amount of hitherto unpublished work. Can we have these fans off? These two, because ei pakha duto jodi off kora jay. Thank you.
So we don't want you to perspire, but we'll bear it with a smile.
For your sake.
Yes. But your one is off. No, they're not off.
They will be. They will be eventually. Like Potol Babu waiting to become a film star, we are waiting for the mics to come to close. Right. So, we are going to be talking about Satyajit Ray, the writer, and this is the book which I would recommend that every one of you, beg, borrow, steal, or preferably buy. It's been designed by Pinaki, and I will come to him to talk about some of the material which is here. For those of you who may not, how many of you haven't seen this book or haven't read this book? Just raise your hands. Raise your hands. Yeah, so it's a fairly substantial number, probably the majority. Now, what this has, in addition to Satyajit Ray's translations of some of his own short stories, some of his grandfather's stories, some of his father's verses, which were published by Writers' Workshop originally, and subsequently, brought together here, the verses from Abul Tabul. It also has treatments, which is what he would do before he started writing his script, which was strangely enough, apparently, and I didn't know this until Pinaki told me, were written in English. So they were written in English. Gopika and Bhagabain, the treatment of Gopika and Bhagabain is written in English. So you have those. You also have a lot of his translations which were never published because they were in his literary journal. But I was wondering if I could ask Dhritiman a favor, and just to kick things off, we are talking of the writing gene in Ray. আমরা কিন্তু এই অধিবেশনে রাইটিং জিনের কথা যখন বলছি মূলত ওর ইংরেজি লেখার কথা বলছি বা ইংরেজিতে ওকে আমরা যেভাবে পেয়ে থাকি সেভাবেই কথা বলছি. Primarily we are talking of Ray in English. So Dhritimanda, if you would like to give us a taste of his translation of Sukumar Ray's verse.
Yeah, sure. The way, for those of you who are interested, Apurna Sen, friend of ours, has a wonderful rendering of the translation of Gomp Churi, which is available on YouTube. What really fascinates me about, as we all know, Abul Tabul is not easy to translate because it has weird things, weird beings, weird words, weird concepts. So you have to, in Professor Purushottam Lal's terminology, you have to transcreate those and keep meter and rhyme in mind. So you have to do all of these things when dealing with Abul Tabul. Now, the Satyajit Ray's translations of Abul Tabul are absolutely delightful. For brevity of time purposes, I am going to read the translation of Khichuri, which in the English is stew, that is S-T-E-W, stew much. A duck once met a porcupine. They formed a corporation which called itself a porcu-duck, a beastly conjugation. A stork to a turtle said, "Let's put my head upon your torso. We, who are so pretty now, as turtle would be more so." The lizard with the parrot's head thought, taking to the chili after years of eating worms is absolutely silly. A prancing goat, one wonders why, was driven by a need to bequeath its upper portion to a crawling centipede. The giraffe, with grasshopper's limbs, reflected, "Why should I go for walks in grassy fields now that I can fly?" The nice, contented cow will doubtless get a frightful shock on finding that its lower limbs belong to a fighting cock. It's obvious the whale elephant is not a happy notion. The head goes for the jungle, while the tail turns to the ocean. The lion's lack of horns distressed him greatly. So he teamed up with a deer. Now watch his antlers grow. So that's just one example.
Thank you. Wonderfully read. I think you bring out the spirit both of the Bangla and the English. One of the things that intrigues me about Satyajit Ray is not only his own, astonishing, verging on the absurd creativity, but the fact that he never knew his father. I mean, his father was died when he was 2.5 years old. He has a wonderful tribute to his father, Amar Baba Bole, which has been translated and is available here. He obviously didn't know his grandfather either, who died in his 50s, Upendra Kishore's 50s. But, if you look at this page, he is here paying tribute to the original illustrations made by Upendra Kishore, which he recreates in his own way. And I've often wondered, whether or not there is a kind of paying homage to his grandfather and to his father, not necessarily in terms of what he wrote about, but how he wrote about it. And I'd ask Pinaki, who just told me that it took a year to produce this book, to talk about the process of discovering this, Satyajit paying tribute to his ancestors, as it were. Well, father and grandfather.
Yeah. So what happened is, of course, as Dhritiman also knows, Dhritiman is a member of Ray Society. I'm also a member of Ray Society. And Shondipda actually came across a lot of things, this COVID times. He almost stumbled upon kind of treasure trove of photographs and a lot of materials that were lying haywire. That has been sort of written here and there. But many people here don't know that, and since we have sort of direct access to the archive, and Shondipda is extremely gracious, everything happens around him. He tells me and Riddhi Goswami, who is one of the co-editor of the book, to look at this and that, and he always, gives us instructions, and it's a very interesting and happy process. But many people here don't know that there are many literary notebooks of Satyajit Ray. So it's not the Kheror Khata. So Kheror Khata is different, that's the kind of where he writes down the film scripts. But the literary notebooks are many. And if you look at the literary notebooks, they are like, the reflection of his whimsy, So you have story beginnings along with crosswords. You have, doodles here and there. And you have, some, for example, the titling of a film maybe, okay? And then he continues with the story. And strangely enough, while going through that notebook, Shondip Dai and Riddhi were looking at this, and then suddenly we discovered that there were many stories which were actually there translated by either Gopa Mojumdar or Indrani Mojumdar, who actually did the entire Penguin translations, but they were also done by the master himself. So for example, yes, so these are some of the stuff. And if you look at these, you will see that, he never published it. So it was just lying there. Some of Upendra Kishore's stories were in typed, cyclo-style typed stuff, which was almost, added there within the notebook. And then, for example, Baghdad, the magic box of Baghdad, okay? That is an absolute new translation. Arjo Shekhare's Janma Mrityu, that is normally translated by Gopadi. For the first time, we have got Ray's own translation. And we told Indranidhi that, look, this is what we discovered. And Indranidhi said, no, use Ray's translation because that's the most logical thing to do. So, what is very important if you pour through the notebooks, and I hope one day all the notebooks, and there are many in number, comes to fore. And you will be very surprised to also note that a lot of story ideas which are written in Bengali, the story ideas are actually, scribbled in, English. So, so the plot lines sometimes of a Feluda story are just, scribbled in English and nothing else. And besides that, we have doodles, you have crosswords. In fact, you have crosswords that leads to solutions in, Feluda stories like Shomaddare Chabi. You can see how he is actually deducting, all these things. So you actually get a peek into the master's mind of how he writes. So if Kheror Khata is the key to, the films of Ray, I think the literary notebooks, it's a Lal Khata, which used to, and Ritida knows this, is probably the key to master's mind. And I can tell you with a lot of, almost guarantee you that there are still a lot to be discovered. So we are actually bringing out another book called Ray's Miscellany this birthday. But the problem is, the things are so many and it's so strewn apart. And Shondip Da is trying his best, in order to, get all these things together. And we are actually helping him out. But I just hope, we complete a kind of an arc of his writings, especially his translations.
And there, sorry to interject.
No, tell me.
One of the things that has always kind of intrigued me, I don't recall Raya and me having discussed it, but what has always intrigued me is the bilingual nature of his literary creativity, that he slid from very well-written Bangla to very well-written English and the other way with effortless ease. That has always intrigued me, given particularly the fact that his educational background, his school background, is not what we might call a Shaibi school background. I mean, he went to Balijan Government High School, and then he went to Shantiniketan, then he went to Presidency College. So the way I'm not trying to be an Anglophile or anything, but as I say, I find it interesting. I mean, how he wrote English that well, how he spoke English that well. I don't know, maybe it's family background.
I also think, Dhritida, that this movement between these two languages, because English also gave him access to a much larger world in a sense. And he speaks about it when he talks about his Shantiniketan days. He, in a lot of his stories, you can't really get it until and unless you have some kind of background understanding of the sort of things that he borrowed from, whether it's detective fiction, whether it's whimsy, whether it's horror. None of them were very typically Bengali in that sense. There's a kind of rooted cosmopolitanism in Satyajit Ray, which I think makes him, truly great. So coming back to you, Dhritida, of the three of us here, Pinaki has worked very closely with the material creations of Satyajit Ray. I have only admired him from afar, but Dhritida is the one person who's worked very closely with the man himself. And what I wanted to ask you is, how much of his literary sensibility went into the creation of characters or plots or films? I mean,
a great deal. The short answer is a great deal, but to kind of explain that, let me give you a bit of backstory, which is anecdotal mostly, which is to say that, okay, I mean, as you know, as one gets older, one tends to reminisce more, which is wonderful. Which is wonderful, but which can be very boring for some people.
Tell us if you get bored and we will stop him.
Obviously, I'm talking about the days before mobile phones and so on and so forth. So, one by one, Bishop Lefroy Road, what you had to do, or at least what I did, is sort of land up there and glance up at the floor in which the Rai family lived and see if the French windows to his study were open. If they were open, that meant that you could walk in. If they were closed, that meant that he was busy. Anyway, so when one visited him, the talk was sometimes about cinema, but actually most of the time not about cinema. It could have been anthropology, philosophy, politics, environment, etc., etc. And he was amazingly well read in a lot of these. For example, when he made his last film, he had been reading the eminent anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, and the concept of Utpal Datta's character and the sort of reflections on primitive versus contemporary, all of that came from a reading of anthropology. We also know, of course, in films like Ashwini Shankit, for example, that his understanding of Charulata, that his understanding of history was quite deep. So the point I'm trying to make is that his cinema was obviously informed by visual creativity, but it was not just that. It was much, much deeper than that.
Right, and Satyajit Ray as a writer of what is usually dismissed as genre fiction, horror stories, humor, stories for children and so on and so forth. I wanted Pinaki to tell us a little bit about what they discovered as they were hunting through the archives. In one sense, it's difficult to talk of Satyajit Ray because I suspect most of you will have read a substantial amount of his output, either in Bangla, which is the best way to read them, or in the wonderful translations by Gopal Mojumdar and others, Indraji Mojumdar and others of his stories. But how do you, he's also a professor of literature, how do you respond to Satyajit Ray's writings being labeled as genre fiction?
Yeah, it's true in a sense because, but in a way it's also interesting because he was creating a new kind of audience also, it's important that I mean, there is a downside to it also. I'll just tell it that way. One of the problems is that when you dip too much into genre fiction, you also end up creating certain stereotypes, certain kind of patterns which are like, almost which occurs regularly. So let us take horror for example, and he writes wonderful horror stories, supernatural. Khogom, for example, wonderful, or say Batik Babu. A wonderful story about the fixation of objects.
Yeah, but his horror is always, let's say, benign horror.
Benign. Sometimes it also,
maybe am I sort of
Yeah, there are
sticking
some
my
like
neck?
Bishful and which is like not so benign, and
Okay, yeah.
Mr. Shashmole, Sheshrati.
Sheshati. But also, a lot of his horror depends on tickling the imagination of the reader and just leaving it there. Like that boy who made friends with the ants, ki naam?
Right, Sadananda.
Sadananদের Khude Jagat, which is also available here in translation. I think it's an absolutely frightening story because it doesn't tell you how it ends. Sadananda is a little boy who becomes friends with ants, and he begins the story by talking about a person, well, somebody who has a name, and it's only much later that you realize that he's talking about one of the two ants who has died. And you're left with this sense. I remember when I first read it, when I must have been in school or, I couldn't go to sleep because you wonder, has Sadananda gone mad? Has it really happened? That is there. I think one aspect of Satyajit Ray which hasn't been examined enough is his ability to create a sense of the uncanny. In the Freudian sense as well. Something which leaves you disturbed, but you're unable to quite put your finger on it. Sorry.
Yeah,
So-
no, I was going to say, to add to that, is that, here is a man who's making a certain kind of cinema. We all know Satyajit Ray's cinema as being realistic, socially conscious, liberal, contemporary, and so on. But the sort of writing that we have been talking about right now is completely different.
Absolutely.
Has nothing to do with this kind of cinema at all. It is as if a man had created two creative compartments, as
Yeah.
if he took a vacation from making films and wrote something which was completely different.
Dhritiman, one of the reasons can be, look, he was actually writing mainly for Sandesh, right? So it was almost as if he started writing for Sandesh. He actually tells everybody that, I couldn't write. I was writing for Sandesh. And for Sandesh, you can only write certain kind of things. One of the stories which I really like, if you look at Pikud Diary and the other stories, which are really not, the kind of young adult fiction. If you look at this story, like say the life and death of Arya Shekhar Janma Mrityu, which is actually a very philosophical tale, but even within that, he mixes this idea of kind of genre fiction. Somehow, he doesn't, completely make it philosophical and contemplative and all that. He was very playful in the way he was mixing genres, So you cannot actually classify. That's a very problematic thing. You cannot say that this is a horror story and Kogum is just a horror story. And
I think,
I was going to say, what makes it more interesting is the fact that he was occupied with the supernatural or the supranatural, if you want
the
to call
unexplainable
it that.
in a broad
but
sense.
without believing in the divine.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know?
Yes. Without.
He was an atheist, and he
Yes.
was a professed, much like our friend who visited us a few days ago, Javed Akhtar Saab. He was a professed atheist, non-believer. So reconciling these two sorts of emotions is quite interesting.
Yeah. And I think one reason why what Pinaki was saying, the playfulness, is that even in his darkest stories or even in the darkest moments of his films, there is this humor in the very broad sense which either comes before, immediately after, or often permeates the story even as it is being, it is drawing you towards the unknown, towards the uncanny, towards the horrific. And I think that, this is a tendency which was probably there right from the beginning of his writing career. So, Dhritiman, I wonder if you could do the reading now so that we can take questions from the audience.
Okay, I'll do that. Now, briefly, a lot of you must have read a lot of Rai's writing. We all have fiction, his writing in Bangla and English on cinema, which has been, his writing on cinema actually has been a guide to me. in many ways, whenever I've had to write on cinema, talk on cinema, etc. But until lately, I was unaware of the fact that he wrote at one point short stories in English. Have
Yes.
any of you read his English short stories? So, you'll have to suffer me for the next 12 to 15 minutes. I promise not to take more time than that. While I read to you a short story that he wrote in the English original. It was published in the Sunday Amritobajar Potrika on the 18th of May, 1941, which is about a couple of weeks after his 20th birthday.
Yes. One just thing before Dhritiman, this story is also there in 3 days. 2 stories that he wrote, Shades of Grey and Abstraction, both of them are there in 3 days.
Right, so the story is called Abstraction, and this is how it goes. He was 24. Can you all hear me? Am I audible? Right. He was 24, tall and lean. He had lean limbs, a lean face, and a leaner purse. He was an artist. The story starts at a moment when a casual observer could see him sitting on a 3-legged chair in an attitude of utmost inertia. A half-consumed cigarette hung precariously from his lips, and his hands held a book which seemed to absorb all his attention. The same observer would see nothing unusual in the scene, but a closer inspection by one not so casual would reveal the one inexplicable touch in the picture. The book in his hand was held upside down. This startlingly unusual way of perusing a novel is explained by the fact that he was not reading at all. He was not even looking at the book. He was merely gazing at what is called the middle distance. His eyes had that particular wide open stare which reveals that a person is preoccupied. He was, in fact, thinking of the exhibition. It was an insertion in the morning papers which had told him about this. The fine arts exhibition, on a scale infinitely bigger than has hitherto been possible, was to open its doors to the public on the 15th of January. A wide range of subjects and an unlimited choice of medium were two conspicuous features of the exhibition. This gave the artists considerable scope for displaying their talents. It was this announcement about the exhibition which occupied his mind now. So cold and matter-of-fact in print, it had proved to be an unusually exciting bit of news for him. He had waited long and patiently for an opportunity like this. It was the one and only chance of his gaining a certain amount of public recognition as a fairly adept wielder of the brush. Not that he had any illusions about his talents, far from it. He knew that he could barely hope for an official commendation of his work, far less for one of the substantial cash prizes which were being offered. But he must see his picture hung all the same and let the public see it. In that attitude of languid relaxation, with the inverted book in his hand, he gave himself up to meditation. He had to think out a subject for his painting. If he had any leaning in his personal views on art, it was towards realism. Like a strip of adhesive tape, he stuck to it faithfully and tenaciously. Those horrible distortions of nature, which seemed to be the essence of modern art, enraged his aesthetic sense. He dreaded that thing called surrealism and abstractions, a term used for those fantastic combinations of lines and forms drawn with a lunatic incoherence, left him utterly cold and unmoved. The following day, he set to work on his picture. It would be a watercolor, that particular medium being his forte. He had decided about the subject during the previous evening's meditation. It was to be a pictorial representation of one of his favorite scenes from Shakespeare. He would draw Lady Macbeth walking in her sleep and call it the Somnambulist. Never before had he felt so much enthusiasm in commencing work on a picture as he felt now. He whistled softly as he tried various color combinations on a sheet of paper. After he had hit upon a satisfactory scheme, the actual work on the contemplated masterpiece began. For the 10 days that his picture took, he was rarely seen outside the gloomy, depressing little room which served as his studio. For the first time, he was putting all his heart and soul into a picture. The patience and energy which he put into his work now was most unusual in a man so sluggish and slovenly in his ways. The last touches were put on the 5th of January. It was approaching darkness when he finally put down his brushes and stretched his arms to relieve the tension of his muscles. Then he went a few steps backwards and gazed at the easel from a distance, appraising the finished work. He kept looking at it for a full 5 minutes, his eyes half closed and his head hanging sideways. The longer he looked, the more it kind of grew in his estimation. The color, the expression, the composition, they all seemed to bear testimony to his inspiration. With a sudden thrill, he realized that he had excelled himself. It was a far finer thing that met his eye now than he had ever imagined himself to be capable of. It gave him a keen sense of satisfaction to know that 10 days of concentrated labor had not been in vain. But he could not afford to waste time in idle appreciation of his work. It was the last day for sending the entries, and he must post the thing that very night. After all, it was important that the critics should see all that he saw. Going over to the easel, he unmounted the picture and went in search of a piece of string and brown paper. When he came out of the post office, his eyes were aching, his temples throbbing. It was a natural reaction. With slow, heavy steps, he proceeded towards the more secluded part of the city. He needed fresh air very badly. The cool evening breeze did him good, and he returned home after an hour, feeling considerably refreshed. The following morning found him minus the last traces of fatigue. He felt like a thoroughly invigorated man. While breakfasting, he had a casual glance at the newspaper. There was a small announcement by the Society of Fine Arts to the effect that they were gratified to see the unusually large number of entries they had received. The exhibition, they assured, was going to prove an unqualified success. It was late in the evening when he went up to his studio. Groping in the darkness for a moment, he switched on the light. The room presented a sad spectacle with tubes thrown here and there, brushes flung far and wide in moments of haste, and little bits of rag and paper strewn all over the place. He was surveying this chaotic confusion of objects when a sheet of paper caught his eye. It was lying on the ground just below the easel. Somehow, it seemed alarmingly familiar. Stooping down, he picked it up. For a moment, the world seemed to grow dark around him, and he clutched at the easel to support himself. For his hand held his beloved masterpiece, The Somnambulist. It was Lady Macbeth, his very own creation, who was staring at him now with those glassy, unseeing eyes which he had himself given her. When the first numbing shock of surprise passed away, a mist of black, brooding despair enveloped him. It did not take him long to realize what had happened. Once more, he was a victim of absent-mindedness. It was not a new thing with him. He had been guilty of it more than once in the past. But those occasional fits of preoccupation and the consequences thereof had always had a touch of the ridiculous in them. They had never brought any serious consequences in their wake. This time, it was different. It was tragic and mercilessly so. He felt sick and feverish. How the committee must have laughed when they received a parcel which contained a stiff cardboard and a small piece of paper with his name and the title of a picture without the picture itself. The cruel humor of it made him grind his teeth, and he solemnly cursed himself and his fate. The picture he tore to pieces and threw the bits into the waste paper basket. During the week that followed, he made every effort to forget the disaster. To this end, he resorted to all sorts of diversions which he had never tried his hand at before. He had all but succeeded when, on the morning of the 15th of January, the opening day of the exhibition, he received a letter. He was breakfasting when a blue oblong envelope was handed to him. The neat crest on it revealed its source. It was a communication from the Society of Fine Arts. He speculated momentarily on its contents before tearing open the envelope. It was most likely, he felt, that the Society was making an inquiry about the mysterious parcel. It was perhaps a mere routine with them. Very carefully, with fingers as steady as he could manage to make them, he took the note out. "Dear Sir," he read, "we feel pleasure in congratulating you." It was incredible. He could hardly believe his own eyes. Briefly, in a semi-formal manner, the Society informed him that its production, The Somnambulist, was the proud winner of a first prize. The note concluded with an invitation to the opening ceremony of the exhibition. His brain was in a whirl now. He felt more perplexed than pleased. The first ecstatic thrill passed away, giving way to a realization of the other utter improbability of the whole thing. He reached the town hall half an hour later, breathless and gasping with a suppressed excitement. The exhibition was on the first floor. He raced up the magnificent carpeted staircase, taking 3 steps at a time. The hall itself presented a truly colorful spectacle. All the 4 walls of it were teeming with pictures. Pictures of varying sizes, from the smallest miniatures to the most colossal canvases. With a heart beating wildly with excitement, he started scanning the pictures. Each of the prize-winning works had a neat label attached to its bottom, announcing the name of the artist and the title of the picture. He decided to concentrate on those little bits of paper. After an hour's scrutiny, he had exhausted the north, the east, and the south walls. Landscapes, figures, still life studies, sketches in various media. Nothing had escaped him. The thing was proving to be an ordeal for his eyes, which were now red and aching. Only his determination to solve the mystery helped him to carry on. But it was with an ebbing enthusiasm that he faced the west wall. His heart sank lower when he saw what confronted him. They were those dreadful, nightmarish paintings, those abstractions. Reluctantly, he glanced at the label below the first picture, which was the first prize winner. The name seemed familiar. Why? It was his own name. And the title, The Somnambulist. But what was this bizarre-looking thing, this weird configuration of multicolored brush strokes? Surely he had never drawn anything, but a sudden flash of recognition told him. It was the paper he had tried his color scheme on. Thank you.
This is by Satyajit Ray when he's just gone to Shantiniketan. That's around the time that he wrote it. Magnificent story. Before I come to questions from the audience, I just want Pinaki to give us...
Say something about this story.
Dhritiman Da wants to say something about the story, which is so wonderfully read out for all of us.
Thank you. Again, digression. As we know, Satyajit Ray, everything that he did, whether it was cinema or whether it was writing or whether it was painting, well, painting not so much because he went to Kala Bhavan, but certainly as far as writing and filmmaking is concerned, he was self-taught. We know that. What caught my attention was that although he was writing this when he was 20 years old, he had already mastered the technique of breaking up a story into episodes or chapters, of constructing a story, not just writing with a sort of stream of consciousness kind of style, but of constructing a story. That's the first thing. The second thing that suddenly occurred to me is that it's a story which would make a marvelous film, actually. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah. So, Pinaki, just a couple of minutes or few sentences on how difficult was it to put together a book like this, given the huge heterogeneity of the material that you had to handle?
So it's really difficult. Let me tell you that one of the problem is familiarity. Most of you know Satyajit Ray so well. Even the smallest mistake will be not, exonerated, So that's the first thing. So Shondip Da is the editor of this story, of this book. And Riddhi Goswami is the co-editor, and I'm the designer. So we work together. So what we used to do is to put things together. Sometimes we have to transcribe very complex writings of Ray. Sometimes he used to write in a tearing hurry. So, his handwriting is not decipherable right away. So, now we have sort of, Shondip Da, of course, knows this very well. So he helps us at every step, and we sort of work around him. The problem that we faced is the way to arrange this material, because it comes as very amorphous in nature. So we have all this chunk here, chunk there, and to put it across. So what we do is we try many formats. And what I do is I also design it as, Shondip Da and Riddhi edit the stuff. So what happens is it becomes a kind of a happy marriage. So if you look at the entire book, the drawings are all Satyajit Ray's himself. But what I tried to do is that I tried to change the format of the book. So, the drawing format is a bit more, contemporized, So, the editing is also done likewise. So we did a lot of dummies. And the dummies seemed never to be, never ending. I mean, there were so many dummies, and my computer got filled up with so many, replica of the same files, At the last part, in fact, I must tell you, Penguin India and Premanko Goswami, who was our executive editor, he helped us a lot, in sort of giving a final kind of, shape. So what we did was, once that was done, Shondip Da, Riddhi and I sat with Premanko, and we tried to, rationalize what should be in and what should be out. Okay, so it's also a matter of choice. It's also a matter of economy, because I personally think, economy is something that Ray excelled in every sphere. And when we are writing a book on Ray, we cannot just go overboard with anything. My job is very complicated, and I must tell you, I'm like a wicket keeper. If I drop a catch, I'll be absolutely castigated. But if I even do a good stumping, nobody will praise me. My aim is to bring out the best of Ray. All these are Ray's design. And it is important that you actually bask in the glory of his design and his writings. So we are, in a way, and Shwantipda tells us this, we are in a way kind of ciphers, who are just putting this thing together. But this is what, probably have done a bit lesser job than what the master himself could have done. Probably he could have added something more to it. But we will always try, because he's no more. We can just go on trying, putting all this so that, the future generations can take in a kind of a slight taste of what he was all about, pure perfection.
I think good words to end on when it comes to Shotit Rai, pure perfection. I think we have time for some questions from the audience. So are the other people with the microphones ready? Yeah, there's a question here. Yeah.
Firstly, thank you for the wonderful session. Good to see Samantak Da here, because we don't get to see you much in the department now that you have become the Pro VC. So my question to you would be on the work Todai Badha Ghoraddim, which is quite the opposite of what we see in the book, I think. Where Ray is doing quite the opposite. It is not his father's or grandfather's work. He's familiarizing the Bengali audience with works of stalwarts like Lear, Carroll, Thompson, people like them. And my question to you would be, can you please comment on a work like that, on an extremely difficult work like that, where in the limericks of Lear, I think he's keeping the sketches intact, but he's not translating, but creating new limericks. And also I would ask you if you think it is possible to, translate a work like Torai Badha Ghoraddim back into English or any other language. Thank you.
Okay. You see, there was once when they were trying out machine translation, they wanted to translate from English into, this is in the bad old days of the Cold War, which may be coming back again, back into Russian and back into English. So when the final English so it was translated from English to Russian and back into English. So the back translation into English came out as, the meat indeed is good, the vodka indeed is good, but the meat is rotten. So they said, where has this come from? So they looked up the original, and the original said, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. So that's what happens when you translate back into something. And there are many examples of this, in fact, in Bangla, of people who have translated from typically English into Bangla, and then it's been translated back into English, and it always presents difficulties. One aspect that we did not touch on, because we don't have a great deal of time here, is that of Ray the translator. That would take a separate discussion altogether, because in a sense a lot of his films are also translations, and unlike a lot of other filmmakers, they go through the process of being translated into script, treatment, script, and then into visuals. I mean, think of Shatranj Ki Khiladi, which is based on a Premchand short story. And indeed Sadgati, for example, and so many others. So I think three things I would say very quickly about Shotit Rai, the translator. One is he wanted his target audience, as we say, his readers, to not be in any quandaries or problems about what is happening. He wanted it to be clear. He was always somebody who wanted to communicate as clearly as possible, even if it was difficult things, number one. Number two, he was respectful towards the source material, but not bound by it. So he could take certain liberties, both in his films as well as in his other translations. And the third was, we have to remember that he was a master of at least two languages. of English and of Bangla. So when he's taking something from Lear, whom he often, sort of speaks of as one of his gurus when it comes to writing verse, or Carroll, who was not just his guru but his father's guru in a sense. So he's respectful towards them, but he's then trying to get Bangla equivalents for it. And he's very clear that if you read any of his short stories, if you read any of his writings, this man who's such a great experimenter on film, when he writes, he tries to keep things as simple as possible. So I think these three elements, but I shouldn't start giving you a lecture here despite my absence from the department. Next question, please. And please, somebody from the Kalam, tell me how much time you have left. Yes, there's a gentleman there. See, they have given us so much light that you've been left in the dark, not something Satyajit Ray would have liked. Yeah, go ahead.
Me.
Yeah, we can.
My question is to Dhritiman Babu. Sir, it's an honor, first of all, to talk to you. My question is that, because we are talking about how Ray was inspired by his family, Sukumar Ray was dealing with the very symbolic political approach when it came to Ekushe Ain or Hojoborlo even. When Ray took on the political ideologies, he was making something like Hirok Rajat Deshe, which can be taken as simple children's story or something so deeply moving anti-war rhetoric. So what I am trying to ask is, how was it as an actor to deal with political ideologies when you were doing a Podatik, which was with Mridhan Sen, something that is openly leftist and a critique of the leftist ideology. But when it came to Ray, he was making a Pratitondi, which was not taking on the political ideologies head-on, but symbolically. But later on, when you would return in Aguntuk, his approach is more tell, don't show. So what changed and how Ray evolved according to you?
I am afraid that I'm not sure that I understand your question, or, I am not sure that I quite understand which question you want me to answer. But let me say briefly that, both Satyajit Ray and Mrinal Sen come from the same time, as you know, and they came. They all were nurtured in a certain, let me call it a spirit of India, which was a secular, progressive. We can use the word liberal, socialist atmosphere, and of course, there were family backgrounds and traditions as well. Rai's was of one kind, Mrinal Sen's was of another kind. But they were both, I think we can use the term progressive to define them both. And it seems so sad that in such a short period of time, we today are living in such different and in such depressing times, in such, fundamentalist, vicious times. Anyway, that's a subject for another day, probably. But to answer your question, the basic answer is that they were two individuals, and while they were each political in their own way, I can't think of one single Satyajit Ray film which in some way or the other is not socially conscious. Exactly. But he did not, let us say, wear his social consciousness or his political beliefs on his sleeve, which Mrinal to some extent tended to do. He was entitled to that, which is why Podatik was the way it was. But then you have to remember that Podatik, which was the third film in a trilogy in a sense, Podatik actually questioned some of the development, some of the things that were going on then in the name of a radical left movement. And he got, of course, in those days there was no trolling because there was no social media, fortunately. But he got criticized for that too. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know whether I've been able to answer your question. But that's all I can think of right now for the moment.
I think we have run out of time. Yes. One last question? Okay. Right at the end. Yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the amazing session. The conversation needs to be going on. So I rather have two questions or one question and a request. So my first question is, Ray always knew that his work has language barriers, right? So, and though he has created a lot of works in English, I want to know, or I want some suggestions from you, that what should the next generation of people who are not non-Bengali speaking people should read and know about Ray, and what are the ways, what are the books? So that is because lost in translation is also a big problem in Ray's works. So
That's
that
the question. What's the request?
Yeah, the request is
List of
towards
books.
Dhritiman Babu, and big fan here, sir, especially about from Pratidondis. So can you comment on the character and the complexity that he was facing while, because I think his character has shades of Ray's love for Kolkata and his own roots. And Siddhartha was also in some ways was afraid to leave his roots behind. So what was your reaction on that? Was like,
You know, I'm sorry, but I think we'll give the second one a miss now, because if we attempt it, Samantak and the speaker after this are absolutely going to slaughter me, because we are seriously out of time. So I'm sorry, but I think we'll have to give that one a miss now, because it's going to take time. But the first one, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, ultimately you have to read Satyajit Ray's stories in Bangla, but there are lots of good translations, and Penguin is going to bring out more. That's the best way to approach him. But when you talk of the language barrier, I just want to remind you that when his films were subtitled, he looked at the subtitles himself, and he subtitled a lot of them himself. So if you look at the Gopigain Bagamain with English subtitles, they're absolutely brilliant, the subtitles.
One thing I want to tell you, when Penguin brought out all the translations first, it was translated by Gopa Mojumdar. She was chosen by Satyajit Ray himself, and she was given approval by the master because he was alive when the first translations came out. And if you look at the first translations, the first tranche of translations that came out, they have forewords, short forewords written by Satyajit Ray himself. He absolutely looked through everything. So they are more or less faithful. Gopadi did a wonderful job, and it was carried on by his sister Indranidhi, who is almost carrying that legacy out. So maybe next time we will have different translators as well. But I think it is fine. I mean, you can just go through the Penguin editions.
Yeah, the director of I can see the director of the festival. She's there waiting to drag us off the stage. So thank you very much. We'll keep the rest for
Thank you
another
all.
time.
One of the joys of being a festival director come slave is to plan these sessions, and one of the curses is to stand there and make big eyes at the panelists. So thank you for the first, and sorry about the second. So we now come to the final session of the Tata Steel Kolkata Literary Meet, held in association with Victoria Memorial Hall. I am out of breath and my voice is dead. But I'd like to do the vote of thanks before Simiji's session. And I'd like to thank Tata Steel for being the spine of this festival, for being so patient with all of us. I'd like to thank Victoria Memorial. And before